I watched them take my children through the kitchen door. It was the 30th anniversary of Harte Logistics, a Nashville legacy built on the silent labor of the reliable. My father, Michael, adjusted his silk tuxedo, looking through me as he signaled the waitstaff. He claimed the legacy table was reserved for those who represented the brand, his exact words. My sister, Madison, sat under the crystal chandeliers at the head of the room, while my 10-year-old son and 7-year-old daughter were ushered toward the service entrance. That night, my 15-year contract of compliance finally expired. For 15 years, I had functioned as the silent, unpaid COO of my father's ego, managing his business and his image while sacrificing my own voice. But seeing my children treated like second-class citizens in a house I helped build was the final breach of that unspoken agreement. Do you think that was a simple oversight or a calculated move to keep me in my place? My parents call it reliability. I call it a specialized form of self-sabotage. I've been underwriting since I was 19. For over a decade, I acted as the silent investor in my father's public image, a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill while he took all the dividends. Looking back now, I didn't realize that my competence was being treated as a family resource to be harvested rather than a person to be respected. In the last 12 months alone, I moved $12,000 to my sister, Madison, through a series of urgent wire transfers. I didn't do it because I was a pushover. I did it because my mother weaponized my empathy, calling me in tears to claim Madison was facing eviction. I treated those transfers as emergency loans, blinded by a sense of sisterly duty that Madison used as a weapon against my bank account. Those funds didn't go toward rent or groceries. They went toward maintaining the aesthetics of a woman who is perpetually between jobs, but never between luxuries. Then there was this anniversary gala. My parents, Michael and Michelle, belong to a generation that views family loyalty as a debt with no statute of limitations. I spent 5 months acting as the unpaid chief operating officer for this event. I negotiated the vendor contracts, leveraged my personal connections with freight carriers to ship in the custom decor, and personally guaranteed the payment schedules for the florists and the band. If I had invoiced Harte Logistics at my standard consulting rate, the bill would have easily exceeded $25,000. I handed over that labor for free, operating under the delusion that professional utility could be traded for emotional security. It took me years to understand the psychological phenomenon known as the scapegoat's competence trap. In toxic dynamics, parents often punish the capable child with more responsibility while rewarding the entitled child with more praise. They didn't worship Madison because she was successful. They worshiped her because she was a projection of their own vanity. And they didn't exploit me because they hated me. They exploited me because I was the only one who could keep the house of cards from collapsing. If I'm being honest, I had become the designated adult for 3 other adults who had never once been forced to look at the fine print of their own lives. I was the gears that kept the Harte family legacy turning, and I assumed that being the engine meant I was part of the machine. I spent 90 days checking every gold leaf place card, every dietary restriction, and every table setting. I knew the floor plan of this Nashville ballroom better than my own living room. But as I stood in the lobby tonight, I realized that while I had built the house, I was still being asked to use the servants' entrance. My father's assistant practically blocked the main aisle, funneling my children toward the back. I tried to protest, but Michael hissed that important people were arriving. They weren't just sent to the kitchen. They were tucked into a cramped, windowless staff break room safe from the hot stoves, but treated like a shameful secret that didn't fit his brand. Table 42 was a utilitarian island tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain, far enough from the crystal chandeliers to be invisible, but close enough to the swinging kitchen doors to hear the frantic shouting of the line cooks. My 10-year-old son, Leo, was staring at a plate of cold bread while my 7-year-old daughter, Maya, nervously twisted a cloth napkin. This was the staff table, a place reserved for the photographers I had hired and the security team I had vetted. My father, Michael, appeared at my elbow, adjusting his cufflinks with the unhurried grace of a man who has never been told he was wrong. He didn't look at his grandchildren, he looked through them. He whispered that seating was a tight equation, that the legacy table was for the brand, for the investors, and for the high-level donors who expected a certain aesthetic. He told me to be reasonable, baby. He said that since I was already running the show, I might as well sit where I was needed most near the help. That word reasonable. It's the most expensive word in a scapegoat's vocabulary. For 15 years, being reasonable had been my primary function. It was the invisible chain of the survivor, a psychological leash that convinces you that if you just absorb the insult, if you just swallow the unfairness, you will eventually earn the right to belong. Looking back, I see it was never about belonging. It was about conditioning. I was being trained to accept that my children were secondary to my father's public relations. I watched the signal it sent to my son. Leo is 10. He is at that threshold where the world stops being a playground and starts being a map of who matters and who doesn't. I saw him register the difference between our table and the one where his cousins sat, draped in the glow of the stage. He looked at me, his eyes questioning if this was the price of our family name. My daughter just leaned into my arm, sensing a coldness she couldn't yet name. Michael told me not to make a scene in front of the city officials. He said that my sister, Madison, was about to give a presentation that would secure the firm's future, and he didn't want any domestic drama distracting from the momentum. He patted my shoulder the way a farmer might pat a reliable workhorse and told me to get a drink and relax. I didn't respond. I just stood there, feeling the weight of the USB drive in my purse, and realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. Madison stepped into the spotlight, shimmering in borrowed confidence. She was holding a microphone as if she had earned the platform, while my parents watched from the front row with eyes full of unearned pride. Her voice carried through the ballroom, smooth and rehearsed, as she began presenting the Harte strategic logistics model. It was a complex, proprietary framework designed to optimize cross-continental freight routes, a system I had spent 3 years building from raw data and late nights. She presented my spreadsheets, my cost-benefit analyses, and my vendor ranking algorithms as her own consultancy initiative to a city official who sat leaning forward, mesmerized by the data. At the time, I didn't realize the depth of the theft. I sat at table 42, the hum of the kitchen behind me, and pulled my phone from my clutch. I didn't need a laptop to find the truth. I just needed the access logs. My screen glowed in the shadows of the staff area as I logged into my secure cloud drive. I saw the digital footprint instantly. 14 days ago at 2:37 a.m., Madison had accessed my master planning files from an unauthorized device. She had shared every strategy, every slide, and every proprietary formula to her personal email address. Looking back now, I see the irony of her pearls. She was wearing our mother's heirloom set, a symbol of a legacy she was systematically strip mining while I sat among the help. This wasn't just a sibling rivalry. It was professional, intellectual property theft sanctioned by parental favoritism. My father nodded as she reached the climax of her pitch, a $100,000 contract that would have secured his firm for another decade. He believed he was witnessing his favorite daughter's brilliance when he was actually watching a hollow performance fueled by my stolen labor. I felt the last thread of familial obligation snap like a dry reed. In logistics, we have a term for this, a total system failure. When one node consumes all the resources of the network without contributing any value, the network eventually ceases to function. I was the network, and I was about to go offline. I closed the cloud log, the light from my phone reflecting in my eyes, and watched her take a bow to thunderous applause. She thought she had won. She didn't understand that a portfolio built on theft only works if the person you stole from continues to sign the checks. The venue manager approached table 42 with the guarded expression of a man who knows a storm is coming and is trying to decide which way to run. He was holding a black leather folder like a summons. My father, Michael, had pointed him in my direction with a careless flick of his hand, never breaking his conversation with the donor. He assumed the machine would keep running as long as he gave the orders. "There is an overage on the premium bar service, Miss Harte," the manager whispered, leaning in so the security guards wouldn't hear the details. $9,000 beyond the initial deposit. "Your father said you were the one to handle the accounting tonight." I looked at the folder, and then I looked at the manager. My voice came out flat, clinical, the sound of an auditor closing a bankrupt file. I am not a partner in Harte Logistics, nor am I an employee. I am an independent contractor whose services have just been concluded. The manager's eyes darted toward the head table, but the guarantees, your name is on the vendor list. "Check the fine print," I said, pulling out my phone and opening my banking app. The personal guarantee I signed for this venue was contingent on my status as the lead coordinator. I am no longer in that role. I have just locked the corporate card for all incidental charges and overages. Effective 10 p.m., I am withdrawing my financial backing for all outstanding services. Any further charges from the premium bar to the overtime staff fees are now the sole responsibility of Michael Harte. It was a professional severance, a surgical removal of the only thing keeping his prestige afloat, my credit and my labor. Looking back, it was the moment the version of me that lived for their approval finally drew its last breath. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, a sound that seemed to cut through the ambient music and the forced laughter. Michael saw me moving. He intercepted us halfway to the exit, his face a deep, mottled red. "What are you doing, Skylar?" "The gala isn't over. Sit back down and fix whatever problem this man has." "I'm not fixing anything, Michael," I said. "I'm choosing how I spend my resources. And I'm starting by taking my children to a table where they are allowed to sit in the light." "You're embarrassing this family," he hissed, his hand reaching for my arm as if to steer a disobedient child. I stepped out of his reach, my spine straight. "I am not embarrassing you. I am simply itemizing the cost of your entitlement. You told my children to eat with the help, so consider this me officially resigning as the help." "You'll regret this," he warned, the words sounding hollow now that the power dynamic had shifted. "I used to think that," I said. "Turns out I only regret every time I didn't do it sooner." I didn't wait for the shouting match that was inevitable once the venue manager reached my father. Before the first bill was presented, I turned my back on his toxic legacy. I chose to be the mother who protects her children from the fallout, rather than the daughter who stays to watch the building burn. I put one hand on Leo's shoulder and guided Maya toward the heavy double doors. As we stepped out into the sharp October Nashville air, I felt the invisible chain fall away. It was cold, and it was clean. Behind us, my father was left standing with a bill he didn't know how to pay and a reputation he no longer had the competence to protect. Dad thought I was a safety net. He didn't understand that when the net gets tired of being trampled on, it simply lets go. The silence that followed was heavy. Within 48 hours, the structural integrity of the Harte family brand began to dissolve. My sister, Madison, was the first to feel the impact of the vacuum I had created. On Monday morning, the city official she had spent the gala wooing requested a technical breakdown of the freight tracking model she had presented as her own. He asked one simple question about the deadhead mileage optimization and how the algorithm handled fuel surcharges in real time. Madison didn't just lack the answer. She stared at him blankly, unable to even define the basic industry terms I had written into the very slides she was presenting. She couldn't explain the data grain or the algorithmic logic because she had never actually done the work. As the project collapsed, I sent my father one final digital document, an itemized invoice for $25,000. It was a professional billing for my years of unpaid executive consulting and the strategic planning of the very gala he used to humiliate my children. It wasn't just about the money, it was about finally putting a market price on the labor they had spent a decade devaluing. The professional fallout was surgical. Without my signature on the vendor guarantees, the logistics network that propped up Harte Logistics began to pull back. Suppliers I had worked with for a decade called me confused and concerned. I simply told them that I was no longer the signatory for Michael's firm. One by one, the credit lines they had extended based on my reputation were rescinded. This wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a systematic withdrawal of trust. I spent that Monday evening archiving 47 text messages from extended family members I hadn't heard from in years. They used words like shameful and vindictive, but I didn't engage. It took me a long time to understand the illusion of power my parents believed they were the ones in control, but they were merely holding a steering wheel that wasn't connected to the engine. I was the engine. And I had finally decided to move in a different direction. Sunday mornings in Nashville finally belonged to me. It has been 2 weeks since the gala, and the silence of justice is far louder than any argument we ever had. My parents didn't face a cinematic bankruptcy. They faced a quiet, necessary downsizing. Michael and Michelle had to sell the legacy estate and move into a 2-bedroom apartment that doesn't require a professional landscaping crew to maintain. It was the inevitable result of a business that had spent 30 years confusing a daughter's loyalty with an interest-free loan. Looking back now, I see that the Harte family brand wasn't destroyed by my exit, it was merely revealed. Without my professional signatures and my weekend labor to prop up the image, the house of cards simply became visible to the rest of the world. Madison is currently living with them in that smaller space. She still posts on social media, trying to frame the move as a minimalist lifestyle shift. But the industry knows the truth. The city official she tried to woo at the gala hasn't returned her calls since he realized she couldn't explain the data she had stolen from my drive. I spent this morning in my pajamas, making pancakes with Leo and Maya. There were no gold leaf place cards and no velvet curtains to hide behind. We sat at a wooden table I bought with my own salary, in a home that isn't a museum for someone else's vanity. Leo measured the flour with a focus that reminded me of my own, while Maya sang a song she'd made up about the syrup. At the time, I didn't realize how much of my identity was tied to being my family's perpetual solution. I realize today that true wealth isn't found in a $100,000 contract or a legacy table. It's found in the peace of a room where no one is being asked to pay an emotional tax for the privilege of sitting down. I've spent my entire life as the designated adult, the one who kept the lights on and the vendors happy. Now, I am just a mother, and that is a much higher status role. I still get the occasional message from my mother, vague pleas for forgiveness that don't include an admission of what they actually did. I read them, but I don't reply. There is a difference between forgiveness and resuming a subscription to someone's dysfunction. I've learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a parasitic family is to stop being the host. I helped Leo with his math homework after breakfast. It was simple addition, but it felt profound. In my old life, the math never added up. I gave 10 and received 0. Today, the numbers were finally balanced. Reliability is a quiet trap set by those who take. For over 3 decades, I wore that label like a badge of honor, unaware that it was actually a cage I was building for myself. In the logistics world, reliability is the only metric that matters. It means the freight arrives, the systems hold, and the promises are kept. But inside a family that views your competence as a natural resource, being reliable just means you are the most convenient person to exploit. It took me 34 years to realize that being the designated adult is not a sign of maturity. It is a symptom of a deeply broken system. I was the child who didn't cause trouble, the teenager who didn't miss curfew, and the woman who never learned how to say no. I operated under the delusion that my value was tied directly to my utility. I thought that if I could solve every problem, I would finally be worthy of their love. If I could organize their galas, manage their vendors, and bail out their failing reputations, I would finally earn a permanent seat at the head table. Looking back now, I see the fundamental flaw in that logic. You cannot earn a seat at a table where the host has already decided you belong in the kitchen. My father, Michael, my mother, Michelle, and my sister, Madison, they didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a specialized utility, a human safety net designed to catch them every time they tripped over their own vanity. And the thing about a safety net is that nobody notices it until they are falling, and nobody thinks to thank it once they've been caught. They just expect it to be there, invisible and unyielding. If I'm being honest, that Saturday night in Nashville wasn't about a sudden explosion of anger. It was an audit. I finally looked at the balance sheet of my life and realized that I was completely bankrupt. I was giving away my time, my money, and my professional intellectual property to people who wouldn't even give my children a chair. That isn't family loyalty. That is a parasitic relationship where I was the only one providing the host. I am telling this story as a letter to those who always feel like they are standing on the edge of their own lives. To the ones who are the reliable ones in their circles. The ones who get the frantic phone calls when the rent is short, or the marriage is failing, or the ego needs stroking. You have been told that your strength is your best quality. You have been told that your family needs you. But I want you to stop and ask yourself, do they actually need you, or do they just need what you can do for them? There is a profound, almost terrifying freedom in the word no. The first time I said it and meant it, I thought the world would end. I thought the rejection would be more than I could bear. But standing on the other side of that decision, I realized I was only alone in the ways that actually mattered. I was free from the noise of their entitlement, free from the weight of their expectations, and free from the constant low-grade fever of my own resentment. It took me a long time to understand that boundaries are not walls meant to keep people out. They are the gates that determine who is healthy enough to come in. My softness, the part of me that wants to care and provide, is still there. But it is no longer a public park where anyone can walk in and trample the grass. It is a private sanctuary. I've learned that the most honest thing I ever did for my parents was to stop pretending that their treatment of me was acceptable. The Harte family legacy no longer depends on my silence, and the industry in Nashville has adjusted to the reality of who was actually running the show. My name, just Skylar, is enough now. I am building a future for Leo and Maya that isn't based on who can be the most useful, but on the simple, honest math of mutual respect. If you were in my place, would you have sent that $25,000 invoice to your father to settle the score? Or would you have simply walked away in silence to protect your own peace? I'd really like to hear your perspective. Have you ever reached a point where being reliable became a price you were no longer willing to pay? It took me a lifetime to understand that the person you must be most reliable for is yourself. Once you commit to that, you'll find that you don't need a seat at a table that doesn't value you. You're perfectly capable of building your own.